Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for our program, a discussion with Melanie Newport, author of This Is My Jail, Local Politics and the Rise of Mass Incarceration. I'm Ellen Keith, Chicago Collections Consortium Board Chair and Director of Research and Access and Chief Librarian at the Chicago History Museum. For those of you who are new to our audience tonight, Chicago Collections is a consortium of libraries, museums, and cultural organizations, all working together for the preservation and promotion of Chicago's history and culture. We share our collections through our Explore portal, which provides free and open access to members' archival collections. We would like to begin our program tonight with Chicago Collections Consortium's land acknowledgement statement, which reads, Chicago Collections Consortium acknowledges and is grateful for the Native peoples who laid the foundation for the city of Chicago and for the diverse Indigenous nations that reside in Chicago today. When you visit our member organizations and when you experience Chicago's outdoor spaces, we invite you to join in offering respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous people that reside in the Chicagoland region, as well as their ancestors. I'd like to thank CCC's donors, shown here, whose generous support allows us to offer unique free programming like this one being offered tonight, in addition to supporting our Explore Chicago Collections portal. A special thank you to the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation for their additional support of CCC's anniversary celebratory efforts this year as we mark our organization's 10-year anniversary. We are proud to host tonight's event in partnership with the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. The Black Metropolis Research Consortium, or BMRC, is also a Chicago-based membership association of libraries, universities, museums, community arts organizations, and other archival institutions. The BMRC's mission is to connect all who seek to document, share, understand, and preserve Black experiences. Please check out CCC and BMRC's websites and portals for more information. Tonight, I am honored to be speaking with author Melanie Newport about her recent publication, This Is My Jail, Local Politics and the Rise of Mass Incarceration. Melanie is a BMRC fellow, so we're very grateful to be sharing this program with them tonight. I know our time tonight is going to go by quickly, so let's get started. And a reminder to our listeners that we hope to save time for questions at the end of our discussion, and they can be directed to the Q&A. So to begin, Melanie, so thrilled to have you here. This is such an important book. I'm going to start with sort of an obvious question. Can you set the context for us on the distinction between a jail and a prison?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked me that question because this is one that's really central to the project, right? So when we think about prisons, we think about places where people go after they're convicted of a serious crime for sentences of more than 1 year. And traditionally, we've kind of defined jails in reflection to that, right? So thinking about places where people await trial, or if they can't pay money bail, or places where they serve sentences for crimes, for convictions for crimes shorter than a year. So things like misdemeanors. But one of the real opportunities of this project for me was to, as I got into it, I realized that I didn't have the definition of jails that I needed to understand what was happening. And so it really became central to me to understand jails as political institutions, because they are unusual in that state prisons are run by professionals, who are hired usually through nationwide searches. Local jails are governed by elected sheriffs primarily. And so as I got into this project, I really found that my definition had to change, because one of the things I found is that the functions of jails are really pliable. So while they serve these functions of holding people before trial or for short sentences, they also hold a lot of ideas about what we think government should do for communities and crime in particular.
Thank you. So what prompted you? How did you get started in carceral studies, and why did you choose Chicago's jail?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a student of Heather Ann Thompson's when I was a grad student at Temple, and she was working on her book about the Attica Prison Rebellion. I had messed around with a couple of different projects, state prisons, the federal crime control apparatus, and just kind of found something that really stuck. And it was Heather who said, at one point, what about jails? And it was like a light bulb came on. In college, I had worked for my local county digitizing records in their county executive's office. I had studied kind of local level activism in my master's degree. So jails just made sense for me as somebody who understands all these things. And so, I initially thought it was going to be a national project that would look at, jails in New York, in LA, Boston, kind of go where the big jail stories were. But as I started doing the initial research into the newspaper archive, I found the story of Winston Moore, who was regarded as the first Black jail warden in Chicago at Cook County Jail. And I just became obsessed with this story. It was really well documented, his rise and fall politically. And that was just like, hit the brakes. Like, this has to be a local story. And it actually makes sense as a local story because every jail is super different. There's a lot of variability. We see really good work coming out of New York right now, for example, around gender with Hugh Ryan's book on the House of Detention, because there are great sources around that. And Chicago is a great kind of case study for looking at race and the kind of rise of the modern jail. And I have to give a plug. The Explorer Chicago Collections website portal was essential, in helping me make the case for saying, actually, I need to narrow this down and do just one city, because I could go there and see, primarily with search terms like prison or prisoner, because jails weren't quite in the index, to say, like, this is a city that's ready to support this project, which is, I think, especially when you're doing kind of dissertation level research, something you really have to weigh in. So yeah, this mix of like available sources and just a story that I found irresistible were really important.
It's a really compelling story. One of the things I was so fascinated by with Winston Moore, and I want to say, was it John Lohman, there's sort of sociology men who thought they could you talk a little bit about them and that their ideas that they could sort of transform and how they.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the thing, is like, I got way more than I bargained for in terms of just an amazing cast of characters who can help us understand this institution, how it came to be so big, and how it came to take on so many different roles in the community. Joseph Lohman was a University of Chicago trained sociologist, kind of out of the more progressive era Chicago school tradition, who, really viewed the city as a laboratory for their experiments. And he had kind of failed as a researcher. He, and ends up really pioneering this field of applied criminology, where he was like, we're going to put scholars into public agencies and we're going to fix everything. And he had a lot of confidence in his ability to do that. He kind of planted his former students within the agencies where he worked, including the jail in the 1950s. And so, he's really responsible for the idea of a Cook County Department of Corrections and the idea that the jail should have a kind of rehabilitative role. What's interesting to contrast him against Winston Moore, who's the warden in the late 60s and the early 70s, is really situating Winston Moore not just as a psychologist who believed in kind of, emotional transformation. I think but really thinking about him as an African-American who grew up in the Jim Crow South.
Mhm.
And so his story actually pushed me to look at where he came from in New Orleans and how he had kind of adapted to negotiating white supremacist political structures and what he felt people's obligations were to kind of protect themselves as African Americans. And so he saw the jail as a place where you could go learn how to be a better man, right? So that you could navigate the kind of structures of power that shaped that urban world at the time. And, you know, with both of them had varying degrees of success in establishing actually really enduring programming. So ultimately, the warehousing function of the jail proved most enduring.
Thank you. I just was, yeah, you're right. It's a fabulous cast of characters. Could you talk to us about some of the resources you used?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say I started out, you know, thinking of myself as somebody who studied political and really policy history. I was interested in administrative histories. And so a lot of the early archival research was really interested in finding government documents, you know, where are the reports that are coming directly from the jail or about the jail? Where are the kind of legal sources and court cases and that kind of documentation coming from? And so places like the University of Chicago Special Collections Research Center, where I could use the ACLU Illinois papers. That was the first collection that I really looked at. Over time, personal papers proved most important because of one of Joseph Lohman's students, Hans Maddock, has an absolutely massive collection at the Chicago History Museum. And he really hoarded 30 years of jail history that tracks his career as an assistant warden, as a researcher, and as a kind of citizen activist who's just requesting every document he can from the jail. And the other activists that he helped to inspire, particularly the League of Women Voters, whose collections are at UIC, and one of their members, Charlotte Seneschal, whose papers are also at the History Museum, they just proved indispensable in showing me the kind of networks of people who cared about the jail. Mm-hmm. You know, later in the process, especially during COVID, I found that, you know, just secondary sources, digitized reports and those kinds of things were important, but I was also turning to the History Museum's newly digitized photos from the Sun-Times for inspiration. Were really keeping me kind of grounded in the feel of the project that I was trying to kind of retain, even though I was stuck in Connecticut.
The Sun-Times have just been such a wonderful resource. I'm so glad to hear that they were helpful. One of the things that's just so telling in at the beginning of the book is you talking about getting records from the Cook County Sheriff's Office, your attempts to, and the fact that they shred after 10 years, the Illinois Retention Act. And then you've got a really interesting footnote about your experience. Could you just talk to us more about that whole process of trying to get information out of
Yeah. I mean, this is not an unusual problem. Jails and prisons have a lot of records just from the volume of people that they're involved in processing. You know, so I understand why records don't get kept in the way that we would always hope. That said, the Freedom of Information Act kind of request process for specific documents came up short. And I kind of just accepted the line from the sheriff's office that they didn't have anything. It was frustrating at the end of the project after they had approached me that they suggested that they might actually have sources that were not made available to me. And so this is really a project that was done without the help or support of the sheriff's office, which is, as a political historian, that's not what you would want. But this jail has a massive footprint. Right. At one point in the 2000s, they were incarcerating 100,000 people a year. And so I think, you know, that the frustration of a lack of official sources actually helped me to write a better book, because it forced me to decenter official narratives and really look and say, how can I go through the archive with a fine-tooth comb to find everything that prisoners were telling about their experiences? And what does it look like if we center their politics? You know, what does it look like if we think about the place of this jail in the local culture, right? The jail is featured in The Jungle, in Native Son. B.B. King played there. Everybody played there in the 70s, you know? And so, like, while it was frustrating, that actually is part of the story, right? That there are going to be these kind of barriers because we're dealing with a contemporary jail that is more politically closed than it probably ever has been. You know, in terms of like lack of transparency, the difficulty that reporters face in kind of getting stories out about the jail. So I think ultimately this kind of research challenge helped me to think a lot more expansively about the kind of stories I was lifting up in my work.
That's a really good point. And that does come out in all of those stories, you know, the newsletter, the grapevine. Yeah.
I mean, and that's something that like is in the stacks at the Regenstein Library, you know, I mean, and they're because Hans Maddock gave them his little pile of newspapers that he had saved. And so, you know, this is a kind of another piece of the story, is that the archives that do exist show us how much people cared about the jail, right? Not just that they were holding on to these papers, right? They could still be stuck in people's garages or something. But the fact that before he died, Hans Maddock took great care to donate his collection to the History Museum. That matters. He understood that this was a deeply meaningful place that people would be curious about.
It's, yeah, the citations to the Maddock materials are just amazing. I work there, and I was not, this is what happens. We don't always, librarians don't always get to read the stuff that we have. So thank you for illuminating our holdings. I just was so impressed by all the tables and everything that was in Maddock. That was just really amazing. Let's see. And you may have answered this already, sort of in talking about the sheriff's, you know, lack of cooperation. But what was one of the research discoverables you came across while writing the book?
Right. I mean, so kind of connected to that, there was a source that I was kind of reading about in other sources, the 1971 master plan. And it kept coming up as people were talking about kind of why the jail was going to double in size during the 1970s. And this is really the point of no return for, you know, kind of mass incarceration as we know it. So it was the first thing I requested from the sheriff's office. It's how I learned about their retention policies and got very disappointed. And so it was like, okay, I'm gonna try to find this. And it just, I went back through my research notes today from like 2014, and there's just so much whining of like, no master plan today, no master plan. You could see from how people talked about it that a lot hung on this source. And so after I had worked through the kind of obvious parts of the Maddock collection based on the finding aid, I decided to request the boxes where it was kind of vague about what was in there. Unfortunately, that's boxes like 1 through 5. So I only had to get to box 3 a couple years into the project, where I found the master plan. And right, I mean, just the name of it, you know, even though these are very normal documents in urban history, like this is the justification for why we should build a bigger jail. It's the most transparent discussion of the logics around jail expansion, especially under Winston Moore, who's trying to reckon with the fact that he's presiding over the expansion of the jail that is 90% Black in the 1970s, right? So he has to justify jailing Black people to the county board, right, and to other federal funders who were involved in that time. So, you know, I was not prepared to actually read through the document and see that, for example, they, you know, were trying to kind of use projections for how many beds they would need, but they were looking at African-American crime rates in particular, and they're looking at the world that they live in, these kind of planners who had been hired by the sheriff's office and by Moore to write this report. And so they're like, well, if Black women get abortions because of abortion legalization, maybe we won't need as many jail beds. And they just came out and said it. And so, you know, there had been a kind of narrative in some of the older literature about the rise of mass incarceration that, like, this was an unintended consequence of trying to fix other urban problems. But that was, for me, the source that really said, cities chose this, counties chose this. This is what they wanted, and they sat down and planned and justified it. And again, I mean, Hans Maddock is such a helpful interlocutor because he's writing in the margins that actually their math is wrong, that what they're really suggesting is double selling everyone. And so they're going to have a jail that's twice as big. And so he sees in this report from 1971 really a sense that this is going to be a 10,000 bed jail by the 90s, which ends up being true. And it's a complete wonder that these boxes even ended up in the collection, because there's a note in one of those early boxes that says that after Maddock died, his wife June found a file cabinet that had essentially these 5 boxes worth of stuff. And she did the right thing and brought it to the library. But I mean, with the kind of grief and pain that she must have been feeling, he took his own life because of a chronic illness. The fact that she took the time to make sure that those boxes ended up where they needed to be, it felt miraculous to me, and was indicative of her own, I think, political feelings. She had been a member of the League of Women Voters and was involved in the activism of trying to kind of advance jail reform. So again, that level of care that people took to save this story, I think, is something that's really special about it.
I will also add your level of hunting for that. I was refreshing my memory about the size of the Maddock collection. And as you said, it's enormous. And it's one of those where if you look at our catalog record, it says finding aid available in the repository. So it's a draft finding aid. So for you to have the patience to just, you know, to go to request the boxes and look and discover is really, I mean, that's a testament to you as a historian.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Maddock is like a historian's historian. He's annotating everything. He's leaving notes on folders about, these are all of the documents I requested from the sheriff's office in 1974. I don't think they're being shady. Like, he's implying this, like, I think they're just being stupid. Like, they're not collecting good data. Like, he's so engaged in constructing the archive that it's a fun collection to work through, but it also reflects his blind spots. You know, it's still really hard to find the race story in his papers, because that just wasn't where his attention was.
So a lot of this was also possible because of the BMRC. So you were a BMRC fellow. And how did that experience help you in writing the book?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, a great kind of example of, how dissertations become different than books. I was a BMRC fellow right days after I defended my dissertation. The dissertation had been kind of, like all dissertations, they're written under duress. And so I had been really preoccupied with trying to figure out what happened. Why did the jail get so big? What is going on with jails? Who are the players? What's really important in this story? And so there wasn't, I think, that kind of interpretive work or storytelling work that was really happening there. It was like, I'm writing up my archive notes, and this is kind of a timeline of what I think went down. So having that experience the summer right after I finished the dissertation, to really sit down and begin to reinterpret all of the material that I had worked with, and then still more research that I did that summer through the lens of race, was essential, because it was the first time I had really been able to fully sit with the question of like, what does the jail do in the Black metropolis? Sinclair Drake and Horace Caton kind of draw the Bridewell, the city jail, on the edges of the map of the Black metropolis. What does it mean to actually move it to the center? And I was really fortunate because some of the other fellows, people like Nicole Nelson, who was looking at integrated suburbs in the Chicagoland area, people like Gordon Mantler, who's publishing this spring a book on Harold Washington and his kind of multiracial politics, were just amazing for kind of helping me to rethink everything I thought about the jail. And it was tremendously important, that the other fellows were not just historians, they were sociologists and artists and people who were deeply engaged in the community and the experience of being in the city for, I think I was there for 2 months. I spent a lot of time in Chicago that summer, really milking it. In a moment when Black Lives Matter was very active in the city streets, was just an unparalleled kind of pivot point for the book. And it's definitely why this becomes a book about the kind of racial ideologies that really help to justify jailing. And the political resistance to that is because to some degree I had to try to make sense of the questions that people were raising about the jail in that moment. We were so impressed with the scholarship that comes out from BMRC fellows. It's just wonderful. So I gave my 80-year-old mother your book and she said, what will happen? I mean, what do you think the future of jails will be? She said, how can we get people to listen to Melanie? What do you think is going to happen? Yeah, I mean, this is really tough because people take jails for granted. A large number of people are very invested in the idea of jailing. Either, they love the power that comes from it, or they're just very invested in the sense of safety that they feel because of the kind of banishment that occurs there. And so I know that there are a lot of people who are not ready to give up the jail as a tool. And there are very big concerns that are happening as the buildings that were constructed during the kind of jail boom from the 70s into the 90s start to age, right? So this has been an issue at Cook County Jail, is they've torn down buildings from the 70s because they have bad HVAC. There are lawsuits about the fact that the jail buildings are not ADA disability accessible for incarcerated people. So, we're kind of hitting a point where I think we're going to have to start to reassess again, like, do you want to build new jails? Because the buildings that we have are really becoming more uninhabitable than they already were. But that said, I mean, I think the answer to the question of kind of like, what's the future of American jails ultimately comes from, how do we imagine the future of American cities? Do we imagine that cities are places, for example, where like children can thrive and grow and where their parents can get the kind of the support they need to raise them? Do we have great schools and great arts and recreation and all of those kinds of things? I think that can make the future of jailing look a lot more uncertain. And so what's really been attractive to me, because this, at various points in this project, I have been consumed by grief. There was a first draft of this book that was very dark. It was very violent, darker than what exists. It really settled into the horrors of this institution. And to find my way out of that, I really had to go back and again, like reinterpret the sources to find the people who were offering a vision of something different. So, to find the kind of hope that I needed to live with this project and to finish this project, but also to live my life as a human being, I became really interested in the people who were looking to do something else. And so I think, right now at this moment, the Illinois legislature is kind of reevaluating the Pretrial Fairness Act, which could dramatically reduce and eliminate, in many cases, how bail is used as a kind of means of incarceration, so that more people can be free before trial, so that they can be with their kids and their families and go to work and build their defense against the state. And so I think the people who are daring to kind of question the place that jails have in our world is one that's enticing to me. And those are people I'm excited to listen to, because there was a kind of a period of silence, I think, in the archive about other possibilities for a long time. People, like Charlotte Seneschal, by the 90s, she'd been an activist. She started working on jail reform in the 1950s. By the time she's in the 1990s, still visiting the jail, she's like 92 years old, writing handwritten notes of conditions and stuff. And she had come to regard the jail as a machine. She really felt this loss of a place that could be contested, that could be changed and influenced by the community. So, in the short term, I hope that people will, as they kind of rethink the place of jails, think about how to make their influence felt on these political institutions. But I'm hopeful that other visions are kind of finding traction as people think about all of the issues that feed the jail, whether it's through the criminal courts and things like bail policy, or the kind of crimes that are on the books legally, or in the kind of more global sense of like, what does government do to support people's welfare?
Thank you. That kind of leads into all these questions just naturally feed into each other. What do you hope readers will take away from reading this book?
Yeah, I mean, I think a sense of their own possibility. I was really moved, especially as someone who's trained in recent American history, to work with 19th century sources where jailed people said, unequivocally, they rejected the premise of jailing, whether it was through trying to set the jail on fire. I'm not encouraging anyone to do that, or escape, or writing letters, appealing to advocates. They were persistently engaged in trying to claim a different possibility for their lives, because they didn't see jailing as the end of their lives. Mm-hmm. They understood that it might be a part of the journey, might be a hard part, but that they could still feel effective. So, I mean, I think that kind of desire for accountability that people felt, I think, across the sources, is hopefully something that readers will latch onto. And the title, I mean, it comes from Winston Moore, and his kind of claims to, like, I'm the man in charge. But one of the things I was hoping that readers could feel is like, oh, this is my jail. This belongs to me. This reflects my value and the consent of the governed. Do I consent to what this institution is and does and has done, as a kind of trying to renew a sense of political engagement. I am also hopeful that readers will check out this book and think about the papers that they have in their houses. Because so much of the story of Chicago politics is grassroots politics. Mm-hmm. There's so much incredible organizing and advocacy that's done within kind of city and county politics that I hope that people will think about getting ways they can get their stories into the archives. Because I know I have a lot of unanswered questions as a historian, and I know my colleagues are really eager to engage with the richness of Chicago history.
And I think your own personal archives, there's so many notes in here where, something is in the author's possession. So think about, your.
Right. There were a lot of eBay purchases, especially during the pandemic, of just like, what scraps can we find about this institution? And some of my favorite things came from that project as well. So, I mean, I think we can think expansively about archives. I hope people will look at some of the deficits of the research. There's not a lot of oral history, in part because I couldn't get a lot of people to talk to me on the record, which is a kind of classic Chicago politics problem. But I'm really inspired by projects like the Rikers Public Memory Project that are really community engaged efforts to document the experience of incarceration through oral history. And I'm hopeful that people in Chicago especially will think about, like, what does it look like moving forward for us to build a more robust archive that really reflects the breadth of the stories. And I know all of the libraries are doing amazing collecting on this front too. So I'm hopeful. That is the thing that makes me really hopeful, is that this book is not the last word. Mm-hmm. Right. And there's a new future that we can write.
So what do you think that your next writing project will be?
Yeah, this is the tricky question.
Sorry.
So, I mean, one of the kind of concepts that I get to in chapter 6 is kind of the idea of, like, boundless carceral space through technologies like electronic monitoring. The idea that jail can be everywhere. And also, the idea that kind of shows up through the escapes in the book, where prisoners just didn't find the walls of the jail particularly meaningful in terms of how they thought about their relationship to the city. And so I've been thinking a lot more about kind of how do things like disasters kind of destabilize where carceral space is, whether it's through kind of the implementation of curfews, kind of before, during, and after disasters that are enforced by police, the evacuations of prisoners, how buses and highways become the prison, and thinking about, after the fact, how do places like FEMA trailer parks become targets of really intensive policing and sites of real crime. And so disaster, I think, has kind of helped me, looking at, for example, the Hurricane Andrew and its impact on Florida, to continue to investigate the kind of pliability of carceral space and kind of where we think incarceration or policing really happens and who's the target of it. But I don't know. There are still some Chicago stories that have their hooks in me. So we'll see what I end up doing.
There's something about Chicago.
Can't quit that city.
I know it's very imperfect, and that's just one of the things that's just so fascinating about it.
Yeah, for sure.
Before I turn this over to asking Melanie questions we've started to receive in Q&A, I just want to say, as a librarian, Melanie is our dream scholar. She has cited things down to the box and folder level. So, you know, anyone wanting to find what she has cited can. This is so wonderful. And I applaud you for living with such a heavy topic. It's one book I'm going to read again and again. It's really necessary and important. As I said, you know, you've got my 80-year-old mother thinking about it and wondering what we can do. So I just applaud you.
Thanks, Ellen. I appreciate that.
We turn over to Q&A. I think we had a question. Let's see. Oh, it looks like one of them was answered. Reshare the names of the scholars you just said. Oh, and you just did. Thank you so much. And here's another question. Sorry that I haven't gotten able to read this yet, but were you ever able to find sources that would allow you to examine the role of the jail in the Chicago democratic machine, particularly in its connection to political power in the Black community?
Yeah, so this is my friend Alan Mills, who is a legendary prisoner rights lawyer here in Illinois. And Alan is one of the few people who read the dissertation and offered feedback. So yeah, I mean, this was a crucial question for me, particularly, and it was a big part of why I got deeper into the story of the Chicago City Jail, the Chicago House of Correction, which merged with Cook County Jail in the late 1960s. That the machine question ended up being important on a couple of different levels. The first was that kind of throughout the 1960s, there was major tension over the fact that, you know, Richard Daley was kind of free to do with the jail what he wanted. At the same time, there were also grave concerns about the extent to which Republicans at the county level were relying on the jail as a kind of site of white supremacist power, again, by the late 60s. So the jail is kind of a ping pong ball, you know, that's getting hit back and forth between the two parties as they're thinking about either how can we expand more so the city level kind of machine power through the jail. But actually, I think the machine was much more open to civil service than the county was, for example. And so there were a lot more possibilities for professionalization, for example, during the 1960s. In some ways, I think it was a better place to work. And certainly the guard staff who worked there in the 60s felt so. They were probably some of the most strident resistance to merging the city jail with the county jail to create the Department of Corrections. With regard to the connection to political power in the Black community, I would say, you know, one of the things that the city jail story helps us to appreciate, because it was really this was a bulwark of civil service. So this was in the 1960s, a place where from the 1940s to the 1960s, a place, you know, one of the few places where African Americans could get in and get a good municipal job. And so they really started, the African Americans who worked at the city jail really came to be invested in that as a place that was deeply tied to their mobility. And this is present to a lesser degree at the Cook County Jail. But ultimately, once the jails are merged, it becomes a question of like, okay, what are the place of Black employees in the machine? And ultimately, what kind of gets resolved in the 1970s particularly with the firing of Winston Moore, hopefully I'm not too deep into the weeds for people who haven't read the book, is that there is a kind of decision that had been part of the creation of the Department of Corrections to put it under the authority of the sheriff. That basically they came to realize, the sheriffs over the course of the 70s and 80s, these white sheriffs didn't want the jail under the control of the Black employees who worked there. And so there was a lot of effort both to eliminate the kind of oversight mechanisms, like the kind of corrections board that was created to kind of keep tabs on what was happening in the jail. And even more so in recent years, an effort to completely just erase staff from the public narrative about the jail altogether. So I think its centrality as a place of economic power in terms of jobs has become, remains really important, but it's been less prominent as a site of kind of machine political power, in part just because of the effort to really mute dissent among the staff in the public discourse.
Mhm. Thank you. Any other questions for Melanie? Yes, I've got one from Marcia. Oh, awesome. When it comes to mass incarceration, I don't mean to say, oh, but it's just such an interesting topic. Sorry, awesome sounds a little too eager. But when it comes to mass incarceration in jails in particular, what stories still need further exploration? Also, do you think the story of jails changes, if any, if the focus is on women who are incarcerated?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, I mean, what stories still need further exploration? All of them. You know, this is one jail focusing primarily, you know, on kind of the 1950s to the 1980s. There's so much work to be done on the deeper history of jailing. Susan Garneau wrote a great dissertation on the House of Correction. It's kind of early years in the 1800s and early 1900s. But the possibilities, I think, for social history especially are almost limitless. So I hope that people will think, you know, beyond much earlier than the post-war period that we typically think about as mass incarceration. One of the parts of that I'm kind of trying to impact in the literature is thinking about mass incarceration as not just a quantity story in the post-war period or even after the 1970s, but thinking about something that happens kind of in quantity or in substance much earlier. Mm-hmm. So with that, I mean, I think there are stories, there's a lot more to say about the role of Black professionals in activism around the jail in the progressive era, for example. Obviously, we need multiple jail histories for every major city and all of the small ones. The story of jails definitely changes when you focus on women. There was originally a chapter specifically on kind of women in jail and women's activisms. And one of the reasons why I ended up cutting it is because it actually made more sense to try and thread the story of women throughout the book. Mm-hmm. Because women in some ways found more traction in the public debate with their kind of testimonies about jailing. People could kind of say, well, it's okay that men are suffering in jail, but like women, that's where I draw the line. And so when you go to the accounts from women who are incarcerated, I think they're just in some ways more vivid. One of the books that I got off of no, not through eBay. This was some like rare books website. I don't even remember how I found it. Is this poetry book called Lyrics of Locked Up Ladies. I need to donate that to an archive. It's amazing. But these women just bring in this amazing analysis of how they were thinking about their womanhood, their motherhood, their religion, their whole life histories through this poetry that they wrote in the 1970s as part of a rehabilitation program that ends up being too radical. It ends up getting canceled because they're afraid the women are going to riot. Because they're like they're too empowered. And so I think, you know, the focus on women, it becomes really meaningful in that way, just because their testimonies are so powerful, but also because advocates are much more willing to think about the role of victimhood and what it means to be a victim of crime as a kind of factor of ending up in jail. And so one of the first stories about, for example, women who kill their domestic partners and end up incarcerated for those crimes comes from a report that was created by a woman warden in Cook County Jail in the 1970s. So I think it helps us to think about, you know, what are the stories we're missing because people are more willing to talk about women as parents when they're incarcerated. I think it brings into view like, oh, we should also be asking these questions about men too. How are they relating to their families? And that was definitely something that those sources pushed me to explore. And so one of the things that didn't make it into the book, or I think it ends up in a footnote, is Paul Crump, who's an incarcerated writer in the 1960s who publishes a novel while he's in the jail. When I was able to go through his lawyer's papers at Northwestern, the Elmer Gertz papers, there's a royalty statement. And there's a letter from Crump talking about how like he wants the royalties from his book to go toward helping his mom pay for her house, even though he was sentenced by that point to life in prison. And so just, you know, thinking about how he struggled to retain that relationship with his mom is kind of another kind of women's history around incarceration that I think we have to deal with of, you know, how do people maintain family connections and how do they continue to fight for each other? So thinking about women, I think definitely, hopefully helped me to bring out some of the more relational threads in terms of how people experience incarceration. And again, the kind of questions that we should still be asking about, like, what does it mean to have mom or dad incarcerated, for example?
I've got another question. Is there any city that is getting it right in terms of jail reform?
I mean, it's the bizarre part of the timing of this book is that for the first time since I've been really working on this, you know, over the course of 10 years, we actually have people starting to talk about like a national jail crisis. And so much of the reporting, I mean, from Pittsburgh to Houston to Los Angeles and everywhere in between has been about this kind of explosion that we're seeing in jail deaths. And so if you had asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said, wow, Houston is on the vanguard of jail reform in terms of trying to use bail to reduce their population, for example. I think before, even kind of in the early part of COVID, before we really knew what was going on, when Cook County reduced its population significantly, you know, by a couple thousand people, kind of before and in the early pandemic, it was like, wow, the end of this book could end up being really different. I'm not as convinced that that story would be as true right now. It seems to me like the kind of more national story right now is a kind of reassertion of the tough on crime politics that people were really wedded to in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, and how to kind of reclaim the jail for those purposes. So I'm hesitant. At the same time, I think, you know, the most powerful thing to me that's coming out of that public conversation is that there are movements. I mean, the reason we're learning all of this jail news is because people in the community on the ground are organizing, because lawyers are fighting, because prisoners are rebelling in places like St. Louis. So I guess this is also just a problem of me. I'm less interested in the places that are getting it right. I'm more interested in the places where people are saying, what could we do differently?
Mm-hmm. Do we have one last question for Melanie? I will say, again, just please, people read this book. It was so fascinating. It deserves to be read again and again. One of the things we were talking before we went live, and I told Melanie one of the things I found so chilling was her footnote, the first footnote for chapter 4, where she had gotten this King Center Digital Archive, information from the King Center Digital Archive. And the note was, this no longer exists. So she had to use her screenshots. I mean, so the value of preserving things and not relying on it's just kind of terrifying to have that research out there and then have it not there. So as I said, again, you are a librarian's dream.
Thanks so much. I'm really appreciative of the people who work so hard to make this material accessible. And, you know, for the funders, I mean, UIC, the U of C, the Black Metropolis, they were really instrumental in making this project possible.
Well, thank you so much, Melanie. This was just, it was wonderful to talk to you. We could have talked, I have so many things highlighted in the book, but we'll save that for the next time we talk. Congratulations on the publication, and this is a great accomplishment, especially the topic, given the last couple of years of COVID. This is just an amazing accomplishment. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, and thanks for everyone for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
All right, good night.
Good night.